Imagine waking up tomorrow and discovering that the internet is completely gone. No websites, no social media, no online banking, no payment applications. Your phone cannot connect, your computer cannot load anything, and every internet service around you appears to be offline. Then you remember something important. You own Bitcoin. What happens to it? Does your Bitcoin disappear when the internet disappears? Does the Bitcoin blockchain stop existing? Can you still access your wallet? Can miners continue producing blocks? And what would happen when the internet eventually comes back online? The first thing to understand is that Bitcoin is not stored on the internet in the same way that a photo may be stored on a cloud server. Your Bitcoin is not physically located inside an application, an exchange account, a website, or even your hardware wallet. Bitcoin ownership is recorded on the blockchain. Your wallet holds the private keys that allow you to authorize transactions involving the Bitcoin connected to your addresses. The blockchain itself is copied and maintained by thousands of independent computers called Bitcoin nodes. Each full node stores its own copy of Bitcoin's transaction history and independently checks whether new transactions and blocks follow the network's rules. This means that if your home internet connection goes down, your Bitcoin does not disappear. Your private keys still exist. The blockchain still exists on computers around the world. The Bitcoin assigned to your addresses remains recorded in the latest valid blockchain. You have temporarily lost your ability to communicate with the network. You have not lost ownership of your Bitcoin. This is an important distinction. Being unable to move an asset is not the same as the asset no longer existing. Now let us begin with the most realistic scenario. Your internet connection goes down, but the rest of the world remains connected. Perhaps your router stops working. Perhaps your internet provider experiences a major outage. Perhaps an entire city or region loses access. In this situation, the Bitcoin network continues operating normally elsewhere. Miners in other regions continue producing blocks. Nodes continue validating and sharing those blocks. Users continue broadcasting transactions. Your wallet may be unable to update its balance or send a transaction because it cannot communicate with a Bitcoin node, but the global network does not depend on your personal internet connection. You may even be able to create and digitally sign a Bitcoin transaction while your device is offline. Signing a transaction proves that the owner of the correct private key has authorized it. However, signing and broadcasting are two different actions. An offline device can create a valid signed transaction, but the transaction must still reach the Bitcoin network. Until it is transmitted to a connected node and shared with miners, it cannot be included in a block. The transaction can remain stored on your device until communication becomes available again. Once your connection returns, it can be broadcast to the network. This brings us to an important point. Bitcoin does not necessarily require the public internet in exactly the form we normally use it. Bitcoin requires communication between participants. A Bitcoin transaction is simply digital information. In principle, that information can be transmitted through different systems, including private networks, satellite connections, radio communication, mesh networks, or other data channels. Once the transaction reaches a Bitcoin node connected to the wider network, that node can relay it to other participants. However, this does not mean that Bitcoin can function without communication infrastructure. There still needs to be some method for sending and receiving information. A satellite system may help a user receive blockchain data, for example, but the user may still need another connection to send a transaction back to the network. The more accurate statement is that Bitcoin does not depend on one particular internet company, one specific server, or one central communication provider, but it does depend on network participants being able to exchange information. Now imagine a more serious scenario. An entire country becomes disconnected from the global internet, but computers and local networks inside that country can still communicate with each other. Bitcoin nodes inside the country may continue sharing information locally. Bitcoin miners inside the country may continue creating blocks. At the same time, miners outside the country would continue extending the global Bitcoin blockchain. This could temporarily divide the Bitcoin network into separate groups. This situation is known as a network partition. During the partition, participants on each side may see a different version of recent Bitcoin activity. A transaction accepted inside the isolated region may not be visible to nodes outside it. A user could potentially create one transaction inside the region and a conflicting transaction outside it. Each transaction could appear valid to the group that received it. The two sides could also produce different blocks. But Bitcoin cannot permanently maintain two different authoritative histories under the same network rules. When communication between the regions is restored, the nodes begin exchanging information again. They compare the different blockchain histories and follow the valid chain with the greatest accumulated proof of work. This is often described as the longest chain, although the more precise description is the chain with the greatest total proof of work. Blocks from the weaker branch may become stale. Transactions included only in those stale blocks may return to the pool of unconfirmed transactions, provided they do not conflict with transactions already accepted by the stronger chain. This means a payment that appeared confirmed inside an isolated region could potentially lose that confirmation after the region reconnects to the wider Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin itself is not destroyed. The network is deciding which sequence of valid transactions becomes part of the shared history. For this reason, accepting large Bitcoin payments during a serious network partition would involve significant risk. Now let us consider the most extreme scenario. What happens if the entire global internet goes down? Imagine that no public internet, private international network, satellite connection, radio connection, or other communication system is available between Bitcoin participants. In this situation, the Bitcoin blockchain would not be erased. Every node would still hold the blockchain data it had already downloaded. Wallets would still contain private keys. All previously confirmed transactions would remain recorded. However, the Bitcoin network would no longer be able to operate as one coordinated global system. Users could not globally broadcast transactions. Miners could not reliably share newly created blocks with the rest of the world. Nodes in different locations would not know what other nodes were seeing. Some isolated miners might continue working, but different groups of miners could unknowingly create separate blockchain branches. A miner in one part of the world could create one valid block, while a miner in another isolated region could create a different valid block at the same height. Neither group would know that the competing block existed. Transactions could be accepted in one region but not another. In effect, the Bitcoin network would fragment into isolated local versions. The existing Bitcoin ledger would survive, but global consensus about new transactions would be interrupted. This is the most important part of the answer. Bitcoin ownership would remain recorded, but the creation of one globally shared transaction history would temporarily stop. When global communication eventually returned, nodes would reconnect and compare the competing histories. The branch with the greatest accumulated proof of work would normally become the accepted chain. Blocks from weaker branches would become stale. Transactions that existed only on losing branches might become unconfirmed again or be rejected if they conflicted with transactions on the accepted chain. This is why using Bitcoin for final settlement during a complete global communication collapse would be extremely dangerous. You might see a transaction that appears confirmed locally, but that transaction may not survive after the global network reconnects. What about the Lightning Network? The Lightning Network allows participants to make payments through payment channels without recording every individual payment directly on the Bitcoin blockchain. Some existing Lightning channels might continue functioning inside local connected environments for a limited period. But Lightning ultimately depends on Bitcoin's base layer. Bitcoin is required to open channels, close channels, and resolve disputes. Lightning users also need to monitor the blockchain so they can respond to certain dishonest channel closures. Therefore, Lightning cannot permanently replace the need for the Bitcoin blockchain during a complete and extended communication failure. It may provide limited local payment functionality, but it cannot create global Bitcoin settlement without a functioning connection to the base network. So what is the final answer? If your personal internet connection goes down, Bitcoin continues operating normally elsewhere. Your Bitcoin remains yours, but you may be unable to move it until you reconnect. If a city or country becomes disconnected, Bitcoin may continue through alternative communication systems or isolated local networks, although the risk of conflicting histories increases. If the entire global communication infrastructure goes offline, the existing blockchain remains stored and Bitcoin ownership does not disappear. But global transaction processing, mining coordination, and consensus would pause or fragment. When communication returns, Bitcoin nodes would synchronize again and determine which valid chain has the greatest accumulated proof of work. Bitcoin was designed to remove the need for a central operator. It was not designed to remove the need for communication. Bitcoin is resilient because no single company controls the blockchain, no single server stores the complete network, and no single internet provider can permanently switch it off. But Bitcoin is still a network, and every network needs some method for its participants to exchange information. The strength of Bitcoin is not that it can continue operating perfectly under every imaginable disaster. Its strength is that the blockchain exists in many places, its rules are independently verified, and there is no single switch that can permanently destroy it. But what happens if the internet remains online and every Bitcoin miner suddenly stops working? That is the question we will explore next.